Chapter 1851, Sea God Douluo. The only problem he was facing was who exactly was going to be able to stop the true god-level demon sovereign. Was he going to be up to the task? Your insanity will inevitably lead to your doom, Chen Zhenji said in a cold voice. At the same time, his body began to transform. His forward battle armor began to radiate faint light as if it had been ignited, and his entire body seemed to have become transparent. Simultaneously, Chen Zhenji slowly raised his hands and made a cup with his hands, as if he were carrying something very heavy. In the next instant, a blue helmet slowly took shape above his palms. In the instant the helmet appeared, the sea down below suddenly returned to a placid state, and this calmness was spreading into the distance at an astonishing rate. Even the purplish golden godly power in the sea was being cleansed away, allowing it to return to its normal clear blue color. Demon sovereign faltered slightly upon seeing this before her brows furrowed tightly. Is that divine tool that's related to the sea? Chen Zhenji replied. In the human world, there is a clan that has always been protecting the sea from the shadows. Every generation, this clan will have a leader, and that person will be the spokesperson of the sea. I am the current clan leader. A thought seemed to suddenly occur to Demon Sovereign upon hearing this. You're a descendant of the sea god. Chen Zhenji nodded in response. That's right, I am the leader of the sea god clan, so my Douluo title isn't actually Boundless Ocean. Instead, it's sea god. I am the current generation sea god Douluo. The hatred in Demon Sovereign's eyes became more intense than ever, but even so, her current spiritual power was still insufficient to affect the sea beneath her. You're a descendant of Tang San's? She spat through gritted teeth. Chen Zhenji shook his head in response. No, I'm not a descendant of Tang San's. Our sea god clan came into existence long before Tang San did. In the distant past, when soul masters first emerged among the human race, our sea god clan had already come into existence. We have the bloodline of the sea god flowing through our veins, and it was the sea god who left us here to protect his heritage, waiting for the fated individuals to claim his inheritance. At the same time, we were assigned the task of protecting the sea. 20,000 years ago, the founder of the Tang sect, Tang San, appeared on the sea god's island. At the time, the sea god's true inheritance was situated on the island, as well as the sea god's transcendent divine weapon, the sea god's trident. Tang San completed the trials and gained the sea god's acknowledgement, allowing him to become the sea god. Most of the trials that he faced at the time had been set for him by the members of our clan at the time. Once the sea god's trident was pulled out by Tang San, the sea god's island ceased to exist, and we completed our mission. After Tang San ascended into the divine realm, he didn't sever this heritage. Instead, as thanks for the contributions that our clan has made, he helped us keep this heritage and continue to protect the sea. In order to commemorate the sea god, Shrek Academy also set up the sea god's island and sea god's lake. All of this was to commemorate the sea god and our clan. Each generation of the sea god Douluo dutifully protected the sea. When the Sun Moon continent was en route to colliding with the Douluo continent 10,000 years ago, we had intended to intervene. However, the divine realm still existed at the time, and sea god Tang San told us that this would be an opportunity for the entire world to improve. So we didn't do anything. After that, he never contacted us again, and we couldn't sense the divine realm's existence anymore, either. However, the sea god's heritage definitely hasn't ended. We are still protecting it. So even if you become a supposed true god, you'll have to step over our bodies if you want to destroy the sea in this world. Demon Sovereign's eyes narrowed slightly as a complex look appeared on her face. Why? Why does the sea god neglect his children in the sea, but chose to give his inheritance to you humans? You humans are vile and shameless creatures who only know how to slaughter and destroy. What right do you have to accuse us of slaughter and destruction? Chen Zhenji interrogated in a cold voice. A hint of deep-rooted grief suddenly flashed through Demon Sovereign's eyes. Why do I have no right to make these accusations? Once upon a time, I was just an oblivious young woman. All I wanted was to live happily with my husband and my family. Yet my husband died, and my family was destroyed, and this was all by the hands of you humans. I'll have to step over your body. Fine. I'll just have to kill you, then destroy the entire human race to avenge my husband. Demon Sovereign raised her hands and thrust his palms up toward the heavens as she spoke. The purplish golden aura around her suddenly grew denser, and even though the sea managed to retain its blue color under Chen Zhenji's influence, the sky had turned a forbidding purplish black color. Demon Sovereign's eyes instantly turned crimson color, and she began to give off a deranged aura as she abruptly swept her hands in Chen Zhenji's direction. The air instantly became viscous, and all of the air around Chen Zhenji abruptly vanished, creating a vacuum that was releasing tremendous tearing force, threatening to rip his body to shreds. This was an attack of the true god caliber. The light shining from Chen Zhenji's battle armor began to fluctuate violently, and it seems that he was on the brink of being torn apart. However, right at this moment, the helmet on his head suddenly released a blue light barrier that enveloped his body. Within the light barrier, the blue light radiating from Chen Zhenji's body suddenly grew brighter and instantly filled the entire interior of the light barrier. His eyes also began to glow with scintillating bluish golden light, and he suddenly took a step forward to escape from the vacuum. In the next instant, he was already in the air above Demon Sovereign, and he thrust his palms down from above. The surrounding sea seemed to have instantly become completely connected to him, and it was furiously rejecting Demon Sovereign. The boundless power of the sea transformed into a tremendous compression force at Chen Zhenji's behest, threatening to crush Demon Sovereign to a pulp. The helmet that Chen Zhenji was wearing had been left behind by sea god Tang San, and it was a divine tool that Tang San had forged with his own hands in the divine realm, replicating the helmet of the sea god's armor. Furthermore, its quality definitely wasn't inferior to that of the original helmet. He had given the helmet to the descendants of the sea god Douluo to help them protect the sea, and only each generation of the sea god Douluo had the right to inherit this helmet. As the current sea god Douluo, the helmet naturally fell into Chen Zhenji's possession. With this divine tool, even the true god level Demon Sovereign wouldn't be able to seize control over the sea away from Chen Zhenji. This attack was also of the godly level. The purplish golden aura around Demon Sovereign was violently compressed, instantly transforming what appeared to be a cocoon of light. However, right at this moment, the purplish golden cocoon of light began to revolve like a spinning top, forcing out the boundless power of the sea before rising up directly into the heavens. In the next instant, the purplish black color of the sky had turned a purplish golden color, and she swiveled around before crashing directly toward Chen Zhenji like a purplish golden shooting star. Chen Zhenji raised his palms to the heavens, and bright blue light erupted out of his eyes. The sea seemed to have become his foundation, and the sea god's helmet on his head glowed brightly, allowing him to transform into a giant pillar of light by drawing upon the power of the sea. Chapter 1852. Where is he? Boom. A terrifying explosion of energy caused the entire sea to churn violently. The three naval fleets, which had already retreated very far into the distance, were held up into the air by the resulting turbulent waves. Many of the smaller ships were on the verge of capsizing, but thankfully, they were able to maintain their balance as they were connected to the larger ships. From the perspective of the three naval fleets, they could only see an explosion of purplish golden and blue light in the distance, and it was as if doomsday had arrived. All of this had unfolded far too abruptly, and the terrifying explosion seemed to be heralding the destruction of this world. Demon Sovereign was repelled up into the air, but merely harumphed coldly. Let's see how much longer you'll be able to burn through your life force to draw upon the sea god's power. You are still immortal, not a god, yet I am already a god. In the next instant, the blue and purplish golden light had already transformed the sea into another world. In the core circle of the northernmost region, dragons' roars rang out around Long Ye's body as her twin light and dark dragons tore an Abyssal Emperor's body to shreds. As the most powerful being of Shrek Academy, she had led the limit Douluos of the Tang sect and Shrek Academy onto the battlefield, and with the assistance of Gu Yuna and the Spirit Pagoda's powerful beings, they were able to stabilize the situation. They were currently situated on the most important battlefield, and there were already over 30 Abyssal Emperors and Sovereigns on this battlefield, led by the Spirit Sovereign. Gu Yuna was just barely holding her own against the Spirit Sovereign, while everyone else was battling the other Abyssal Emperors and Sovereigns. All of these powerful Abyssal beings possessed varied and diverse abilities, particularly the Abyssal Sovereigns. Aside from Guan Yue, who held the slight upper hand over the Black Sovereign, even the human quasi-gods were finding it very difficult to keep these Abyssal Sovereigns at bay in one-on-one battles. All of the Abyssal rulers above the 30th level were more powerful than human demigods, and they were proving to be extremely formidable opponents, especially for the limit Douluos who didn't possess suits of forward battle armor. In contrast, there were only under 20 limit Douluos on the human side, so the situation had only been stabilized, but wasn't improving at all. Among the limit Douluos, the most eye-catching one wasn't Lon Yeyu, who had just slain an Abyssal Emperor, nor was it the combination of the Heartless Douluo and the Amorous Douluo, who were unleashing their almighty soul fusion skill. Instead, it was Holy Spirit Douluo Yali, who was situated at the center of the battlefield with holy light revolving around her body, virtually controlling the entire battle. She had a leaf from the secondary tree of life in her mouth to replenish her life energy, and the holy light radiating from her body was encompassing the entire battlefield. 12 six-winged archangels were revolving around her, casting all types of enhancements onto the powerful beings of the human race. Her holy light wasn't as effective against abyssal creatures as it was against evil soul masters, but it was still extremely potent, and it was her presence on the battlefield that allowed the human army to just barely maintain a tenuous balance. The only problem was that after being killed, the abyssal energy of the slain abyssal creatures would instantly escape. Viana's silver dragon spear was capable of devouring abyssal energy, but under the restriction of the spirit sovereign's divine origin realm spiritual power, her devouring ability was greatly suppressed. Thus, even though hordes upon hordes of abyssal creatures were being slain, the abyssal plane wasn't actually losing much energy. The area around Viana had already transformed into a sea of rainbow light, and all types of elemental attacks were being unleashed to bombard the spirit sovereign. The spirit sovereign was keeping her occupied, and she was doing the same thing. The spirit sovereign's spiritual power was simply far too immense. Even a normal abyssal spirit dragon was having an extremely significant impact on the battlefield. If the spirit sovereign were to take over control of the battlefield, then the human army would be completely doomed. Thus, she was doing everything in her power to keep him occupied so he wouldn't have any spare capacity to exert his influence on the battlefield. As the battle raged on, Viana was occasionally stealing urgent glances at the powerful beings of the Tang sect and Shrek Academy. Where is he? Why was it that all of the powerful beings of the Tang sect and Shrek Academy were present, but he was nowhere to be seen? There was no reason for him not to be on this battlefield. With their spiritual connection, she would definitely be able to sense him if he were merely concealing himself nearby, but she was completely unable to sense his aura. Where could he have gone? If he had been present, perhaps everything would be different. At the very least, it wouldn't be so easy for the abyssal energy to escape. Shrek's 6 monsters had already appeared on the battlefield, but he wasn't with them. Not only were these thoughts racing through her mind, the same questions were being pondered by the powerful beings of the Spirit Pagoda and the Battle God Hall. Where was Tang Wuling? Golden light flashed, and Tang Wuling fell onto the ground again with a dejected expression. On this occasion, he didn't want to get up anymore. The energy expenditure wasn't all that significant, but he had already exhausted all of his tactics. He had tried all of his abilities and everything that he could think of, but no matter what he did, he still couldn't defeat his father. Throughout this entire process, Tang San perpetually wore a faint smile and appraised him with warmth and benevolence, but he most definitely wasn't holding back in battle. Even Tang Wuling himself had lost count of how many times he had been defeated. The most troublesome thing was unpredictable storm. No matter what he did, as soon as his father unleashed unpredictable storm, the battle would be all but over. He had his own dragon emperor restriction techniques, but compared with unpredictable storm, the former was looking entirely lackluster. I can't beat you, Tang Wuling said with a wry smile. Tang San smiled and said, let's go again. Tang Wuling replied, I can't beat you no matter how many times we go again. Even if our powers are at the same level, you have way more experience than me, and even more importantly, your sea god's trident is too potent against me. Tang San's smile became even more pronounced as he suddenly handed the sea god's trident over to Tang Wuling. All right, then why don't we swap? What? Tang Wuling didn't understand what his father was proposing. Come on. You're saying it's unfair because I hold the sea god's trident, right? Then let's swap. Give me your golden dragon spear, Tang San said with a smile. Tang Wuling reflexively handed over his golden dragon spear in exchange for the sea god's trident. In the instant his hand closed around the sea god's trident, an unprecedented feeling of power instantly surged into his body. This was an indescribable sensation, as if an entire ocean of boundless vitality had been instantly injected into his body. He had been able to draw upon some of the power of the sea god's trident in the past, but this was completely different. For the very first time, he felt like this transcendent divine weapon had become a part of his own body, and as he wielded it, it was as if he had become one with the entire sea. To call this a wonderful feeling would be a massive understatement. All of his physical and mental exhaustion was instantly swept away, and he reached an unprecedented peak. The power contained within the sea god's trident wasn't fierce or violent in the slightest. Instead, it was a boundless and all-encompassing type of energy. Chapter 1853. Remain true to yourself at all times. Holding it in his hand, Tang Wuling was immediately struck by the feeling that he had been reborn anew, that his entire body had been cleansed. Through his divine origin realm spiritual power, he could clearly sense that every single cell in every corner of his body was jumping for joy. It was as if countless small worlds had taken shape inside his body, and countless lives were being nurtured in each small world. This was an incredible feeling that words couldn't describe, and Tang Wuling nearly stood on the spot while faint bluish golden light radiated from his entire body. Tang San appraised his son with a faint smile on his face, then pointed the golden dragon spear at Tang Wuling from afar. A deranged aura immediately erupted out of the golden dragon spear, as if Tang San were holding an insane dragon in his hand rather than a spear. He cast a calm gaze toward Tang Wuling and said, "You must remain true to yourself at all times. Only then will there be light in your life. All emotions of insanity will only ever be surface level manifestations. Perhaps they can infiltrate our bodies and even our hearts, but they can never infiltrate our souls. Whatever difficulties or changes you encounter in the future, you must retain that shred of clarity in your soul. Only then will you prevail." Tang San's words exploded in Tang Wuling's mind like a string of thunderclaps, causing his divine origin realm spiritual power to fluctuate violently. Within his mind, a huge golden character that was completely formed by divine sense took shape. Tang Wuling felt his mind begin to tremble, and in the face of such enormous spiritual pressure, he felt as if his mind were about to shatter at any moment. However, right at this moment, the sea god's trident in his hand released a placid aura to nurture his body and mind, allowing that huge golden character to completely brand itself into the deepest part of his soul, thereby fusing as one with him. After an indeterminate period of time, Tang Wuling finally came to, but as soon as he regained his sight, his pupils instantly contracted as that ferocious golden dragon had already arrived in front of him. He reflexively took a step back before sweeping his sea god's trident upward, instantly entering the spear essence realm. The upward strike was very simple and direct, yet it struck the head of the fierce dragon with unerring accuracy. A crisp clang rang out, and the golden dragon spear returned to its original form. However, in that instant, Tang Wuling felt as if the pressure on his golden trident was abruptly lifted, as if the golden dragon spear had suddenly disappeared. Countless spear projections then erupted forth right in front of him, instantly encompassing his entire body, and it was astounding to him that fury of masses could be used in this manner. He curled up into a defensive position before releasing his golden dragon tyrant body, and the surface of his battle armor instantly became as smooth as a mirror. At the same time, he drew a circle in the air with his sea god's trident in a gesture that was so well rehearsed it was essentially second nature to him at this point. Having already battled his father countless times, he had learned so much through practical combat, and one of the most important lessons that he had learned was that the pinnacle of complexity was simplicity. During their battles, Tang Wuling noticed that his father very rarely used complex abilities. Everything seemed to be so simple, yet veiled behind the simplicity was all types of diverse variations. Throughout their battles, Tang San had never said anything to instruct Tang Wuling. Instead, he was allowing Tang Wuling to learn at his own pace through these battles. The pinnacle of complexity was simplicity. What kind of concept was this? In practical application, this involved imbuing all complex variations into the simplest of techniques. For example, this very simple-looking circular motion contained countless possible variations that could be drawn upon according to how the opponent reacted. All of these variations were concealed within the technique and not revealed right away, so the opponent wouldn't be able to predict what was to come. This simple circular motion had made Tang Wuling feel as if he was sinking into quicksand, as if it would inevitably be his downfall no matter how he reacted. He had imitated this gesture and analyzed it many times, and only now was he just beginning to understand it. This concept could be used on any ability, and the key was to find the core of the technique. Once that was done, there would be countless ways to unleash the technique. And to put it in simpler terms, this was essentially a process of refinement. His Dragon Emperor restriction techniques involved fusing all of his abilities to create several almighty attacks, which was also a very good thing. But through his battles with his father, Tang Wuling realized that his Dragon Emperor restriction techniques were extremely powerful, but they were lacking in variation. It was often the case that after a single attack, there would be no follow-up and certainly no continuation. Throughout his battles against his father, he began to learn the skill of refinement, and only as he unleashed this circular motion to perfection for the first time did he truly understand what he was doing. Not only had he entered the spear essence realm, he felt as if his entire being had also entered a mysterious and profound world. Initially, he was only able to last a few exchanges in battle against his father, but now, their battles had become far lengthier. As long as his father didn't use unpredictable storm, he was already able to resist for a very long time. Clang. Only one of the spear projections unleashed by Tang San's fury of the masses struck the sea god's trident, yet it was as if something had been triggered, and all of the spear projections converged to form a single point that instantly arrived before Tang Wuling. The vicious aura of the fierce dragon instantly threatened to devour Tang Wuling, and his heart abruptly thumped violently like a war drum. His blood essence erupted forth as dragons repulse, and using this propulsion force, he was able to quickly fall back in retreat. At the same time, he slashed his sea god's trident through the air, and white clouds appeared in the space around him, warping and blurring everything. Millennium white clouds. Tang San's eyes remained calm and clear as he gently swept his golden dragon spear upward in what appeared to be a completely harmless gesture. Yet a bluish golden halo suddenly appeared around him like a door of light. Stepping through the door of light, it was as if he had stepped through a span of a millennium, and in the next instant, all of the white clouds were already behind him. That's cheating. Tang Wuling exclaimed. He could clearly sense that this definitely wasn't an ability that his father possessed in his pre-god form. This time of space-time travel was clearly a godly technique, not something that any human could achieve. Tang San's smile widened as he conjured up a series of golden halos with his golden dragon spear. This was none other than his unpredictable storm. On this occasion, the technique was completely different. The halos seemed to possess substantial form, and as they approached Tang Wuling, it was as if they were imbued with the essence of the Great Dou and the laws of the universe. Tang Wuling immediately also unleashed unpredictable storm with his sea god's trident. As expected, now that he was using a transcendent divine weapon, his unpredictable storm had also become different. The sea was now his foundation, and all of his golden halos also seemed to have attained a substantial form. They had been imbued with the boundless power of the sea. The halos clashed with each other, and one halo after another was destroyed. But in the end, the sea was unable to contend with the vast power of the universe. In the next instant, Tang Wuling and the sea god's trident were bound tightly by the oncoming halos. The light faded, and Tang San arrived in front of Tang Wuling before taking back his sea god's trident. Looking at Tang Wuling's indignant expression, he couldn't help but chuckle. You must think I cheated, right? Yes. Tang Wuling replied. Tang San smiled and said, "This is what it feels like to face a god. You have to experience this now as you may have to face something similar to this in the near future. Face all upcoming obstacles with courage, my son." Chapter 1854. Pulling out the sea god's trident. Tang Wuling folded slightly upon hearing this, following which a massive wave of dejection instantly washed over his body. He felt as if his heart were being squeezed between a vice. "Father, let's continue. I don't want you to go." His father's eyes were always so gentle and loving, and regardless of whether they were facing each other in battle or not, Tang San's gaze had constantly been resting on him, as if he were trying to commit Tang Wuling's appearance to the deepest parts of his memory. Tang Wuling was able to clearly sense the fatherly love even as they fought. They were separated by an immeasurable distance, but his father had always been doing everything in his power to leave something for him so he could become more powerful and more able to protect himself. Despite the arduous situation that he was in, Tang San had still chosen to give him the sea god's trident so that it could protect him. It was clear that he was going to leave now, and this would perhaps be the last time Tang Wuling would be able to see his father unless he could find him in real life. Tang San smiled and said, "I'm sure we'll meet again before too long. Have faith in your father, my son. I'll definitely come back for you, and our family will be reunited. I won't and I'm unable to dictate what you do with your life. All I can do is protect my little Kilin to the best of my abilities. You've already grown up now, so walk the path that you deem to be right, and make sure to remember what I've told you." Tang San took a deep breath as he spoke, then plunged the sea god's trident and golden dragon spear into the ground before stepping forward and giving Tang Wuling a massive hug. Tang Wuling was unable to feel Tang San's body as it only seemed to be an illusion, but in this instant, his heart was filled with boundless warmth and sorrow. "Father." Tang San's figure was slowly vanishing, and Tang Wuling was doing everything he could to cling onto his father's aura. His tears gushed forth like water out of a broken dam, but his father only continued to fade further and further in his embrace. The 8th trial of the sea god, battle between father and son, has been completed. Now initiating the 9th trial of the sea god, pull out the sea god's trident. The light of unpredictable storm faded, and the golden dragon spear vanished into Tang Wuling's forehead as a streak of golden light. Thus, the only thing that remained before him was the massive sea god's trident. At this moment, it was plunged into the ground and radiating a faint light. The feeling of being born anew from the power of the sea was still lingering in Tang Wuling's body, and he stepped forward before wrapping his hands tightly around the shaft of the sea god's trident. The tears continued to flow, and Tang Wuling roared, "Father, mother, I won't disappoint you." Boom. Wu Zhangkong's body was sent flying for several hundred meters, and its momentum was only arrested after he crashed into a mountain. An ice-cold aura instantly surged forth in all directions, freezing all of the oncoming abyssal creatures into ice statues. He hadn't sustained any injuries thanks to the protection of his Skyfrost Dragon Ice battle armor, but at this moment, there was a grim look on his face. Not far away, the 3 Spirit Dragon Kings were still standing. They had been attacking the 3 Spirit Dragon Kings for quite some time now, but if these 3 Abyssal Spirit Dragon Kings had to be described through Soulmaster terminology, then they would be the most powerful control system Soulmasters, and of the spiritual control system, at that, even the most ordinary folklore bat would instantly attain title Douluo level power upon being doused in a cloud of invulnerability mist released by the Abyssal Spirit Dragon Kings, and the enhancement was naturally even more pronounced for more powerful abyssal creatures. The abyssal creature that had just sent Wu Zhangkong flying was an abyssal evil sickle that had been enhanced by invulnerability mist. One had to realize that in his Skyfrost Dragon Ice battle armor, Wu Zhangkong already possessed limit Douluo level powers, and he was also a rank 97 hyper Douluo, yet he had been sent flying by a single attack from the abyssal evil sickle, and that was sufficient testament to just how fearsome the invulnerability mist was. The only silver lining was that their elite group of 10 had managed to attract the attention of the 3 Spirit Dragon Kings, thereby not allowing them to focus on any other part of the battlefield. The two sides were currently locked in an impasse, and due to the arrival of the Tang Sex Black Mecha Squadron, the situation hadn't deteriorated any further. They were finally able to stop the expansion of the abyssal army and try to hunt down the abyssal spirit dragons. Abyssal spirit dragons were extremely powerful, but they naturally couldn't compare with an entire squadron of black mechas, so they could only abandon the abyssal army and escape once the situation grew dire. Thus, the battlefield had been completely stabilized, particularly once the long-range artillery fire support arrived from the sea. However, the current situation was still very concerning for Wu Zhangkong. If the 3 abyssal spirit dragon kings were already this powerful, then what about that spirit sovereign? At this moment, he was locked in battle with Yu Yuna, and it was quite apparent that his powers were superior to hers. However, he was displaying no intention of controlling the battlefield and was merely allowing the spirit dragons to lead the abyssal army in his stead. With his divine origin realm spiritual power, the entire battlefield would most likely shift in an instant if he were to begin to exert his influence. Most importantly, Tang Wuling still hadn't returned. The abyssal army had suffered far heavier losses than the human army, but the life energy of all human soldiers that perished would instantly be devoured by abyssal creatures. Yet once an abyssal creature perished, their energy would simply return to the abyssal plane. Under these circumstances, the abyssal army essentially had an infinite reserve supply of troops. Even if the current situation could be maintained, how would the human army be able to continue to resist once everyone ran out of soul power and energy? Even the most powerful of individuals had their limits. Just like Yu Yuna, he was also hoping that Tang Wuling would appear on the battlefield soon. Dazzling stars were shining in the sky, and with each beam of starlight that fell, a powerful abyssal creature would be rooted to the spot. After that, they would be torn to shreds by peerlessly sharp sword projections. Shu Shaowen had already become the brightest star on this side of the battlefield. As the main control system soulmaster here, it was her presence that was countering the 3 abyssal spirit dragon kings to a great extent. At this moment, the spirit dragon king on the left had sustained a huge wound on its left shoulder that had been dealt by Yu Xinglin's sword after it had fallen prey to Shu Shaowen's control. Thus, the 3 spirit dragon kings had become even more cautious, and they would occasionally unleash spiritual attacks to target Shu Shaowen. Shrek's 6 monsters were all connected by starlight shackles, and Shu Shaowen was only able to withstand the spiritual attacks from the spirit dragon kings through their shared spiritual power. No one else had been connected to them using the starlight shackles, as the 6 of them had developed exceptional teamwork over the years they had been together, and connecting anyone else could actually work to their detriment by ruining their chemistry. Aside from Shu Shaowen, the most eye-catching figure had to be Sima Jinkai. He had become the feared executioner on the battlefield with his dragon-slaying saber, and almost no abyssal creature was able to stand in his path. Having been polished by the golden dragon spear, the dragon-slaying saber was truly displaying its might as a divine weapon. In the past, Sima Jinkai had very rarely gotten any opportunities to display his power as he was constantly with Tang Wuling. Thus, it was always Arahang who had shone brighter among the duo, particularly in that match against the Battle God Hall. However, Sima Jinkai had actually also been progressing extraordinarily quickly in his cultivation due to the influence of Tang Wuling's golden dragon king aura. He and Yuan and Yui led from the very forefront, opposing the powerful abyssal army. If it weren't for the invulnerability mist being released by the 3 spirit dragon kings, all of the abyssal creatures on the mountain top would have already been slain slain by them. Chapter 1855, Light of Debilitation. At the third defensive line in the distance, the Abyssal army's attack was running out of steam as all of their main forces had been stopped in their tracks by the powerful beings of Shrek Academy. Under the persistent attacks from the infrasonic aircrafts, almost all of the Abyssal creatures there had already perished, and the third defensive line had been completely stabilized. The infrasonic aircrafts were currently being protected by the air units, and they were cleaning up some Abyssal creatures that had rushed out of the second defensive line before preparing to move deeper into the battlefield. The Spirit Sovereign thrust a palm forward, and the space up ahead trembled violently, detonating all of the elemental energy that Gu Yuna had unleashed to attack him. Gu Yuna could clearly see a hint of crimson light flash through the Spirit Sovereign's eyes, and he released his immense spiritual power before immediately withdrawing it. Gu Yuna's heart stirred slightly upon seeing this. What was he doing? In the next instant, a group of figures that had been hiding in a corner of the battlefield suddenly emerged. These were none other than Abyssal Spirit Dragons. However, as soon as they appeared, their scales suddenly turned a blood-red color. In the next instant, the Abyssal Spirit Dragons suddenly leapt high up into the air, then opened their mouths to release pillars of red light. What kind of attack was this? Even though no one knew what this red light was yet, just the mere sight of this new mode of attack struck concern into the hearts of the human army's troops. The attacks being unleashed by the Abyssal Spirit Dragons were aimed at none other than the cluster of aircrafts in the distant sky, and in response, all of the aircrafts immediately activated their protective barriers. All types of weapons were also deployed to try and counterattack the red light, but the red light merely passed through all of the attacks and protective barriers as if they didn't exist, then fell upon the Soul aircrafts. At least 50 Soul aircrafts were struck, and they instantly turned red. However, that was it. The aircrafts were still flying, and even their protective barriers were still intact, so nothing seemed to have changed. What exactly was this red light supposed to do? Confusion spread through everyone's hearts, and they all focused their attention on the Soul aircrafts hanging in the sky. It didn't seem like anything had changed, and the aircrafts certainly weren't plummeting out of the sky or anything like that. Right at this moment, a series of massive figures suddenly shot out of the abyssal passageway before appearing in midair. These were strange-looking creatures that were around 30 meters in length, which made them slightly smaller than the Abyssal Spirit Dragons. Each of them had a pair of giant bat-like wings on their backs, and they were extremely ferocious in appearance. Their bodies were of a dark golden color and were rather humanoid in appearance, but also quite different at the same time. Each of these creatures had 4 limbs, but also 2 heads, and there were bone spikes protruding out of all of their joints. This was definitely a new type of abyssal creature that even the Blood God Legion had never seen before, and it was most likely the case that they resided on a very high level of the abyssal plane. Several hundred of them had emerged in total, and they pounced directly toward the human army. They were flying extremely quickly, speeding through the air as streaks of dark golden light. The infrasonic aircrafts immediately released powerful infrasonic sound waves in response, but as soon as the infrasonic sound waves were released, the Soul aircrafts that had been struck by the red light earlier suddenly exploded one after another. In order to protect the infrasonic aircrafts, all of the Soul aircrafts had been packed in quite a tight formation. So as those aircrafts exploded, many of the surrounding aircrafts were also detonated, and countless fireballs suddenly erupted in midair. In the blink of an eye, around a third of the Soul aircrafts had been eradicated. As it turned out, the red light that had been released by the Abyssal Spirit Dragons was referred to as Light of Debilitation. Despite its simple-sounding name, it was one of the Abyssal Spirit Dragons' most vicious abilities. All entities, regardless of whether they were living beings or inanimate objects, would suffer a massive drop in life force upon being struck by Light of Debilitation. Thus, even though the Soul aircrafts looked fine, their metals were quickly becoming feeble, and in a short time, the aircrafts had been weakened to an extreme extent. Originally, the infrasonic sound waves didn't affect the Soul aircrafts. All it did was cause the aircrafts to vibrate slightly. However, due to how fragile the aircrafts had become, they were unable to withstand these slight tremors and exploded on the spot. Light of Debilitation was the most powerful technique that the Abyssal Spirit Dragons possessed, but it was extremely taxing to unleash, and they couldn't just recover from devouring other abyssal creatures, so they very rarely used this ability. Furthermore, the creatures that had just flown out of the abyssal passageway were renowned as the most powerful air units of the abyssal plane. They were known as abyssal demon puppets, and they possessed incredible flight abilities and combat prowess. They resided on the 4th level of the abyss, and they had emerged with the sole purpose of filling the Soul aircrafts that had been weakened by the Light of Debilitation. Due to how frail abyssal bomber hornets were individually, the infrasonic aircrafts were virtually a perfect counter to the Hornet Sovereign. In contrast, abyssal demon puppets possessed extremely powerful bodies and were one of the leading species of abyssal creatures when it came to physical tolerance. Taking advantage of the massive explosion, they were already pouncing quickly toward the Soul aircrafts in the distance. Furthermore, several of the abyssal demonic puppets had descended from the heavens, and at least 4 or 5 abyssal spirit dragons had jumped onto their backs to be carried up into the sky. Abyssal spirit dragons were able to fly on their own, but they couldn't do so very quickly. On average, abyssal spirit dragons were slightly larger than abyssal demonic puppets, but the abyssal demonic puppets that had flown down were the strongest and able-bodied ones, and even while carrying the abyssal spirit dragons on their backs, their speed wasn't affected in the slightest as they rose back up into the air again to catch up to their brethren. It was clear that the infrasonic weapons had attracted the attention of the abyssal plane. Indeed, a weapon of this nature that was capable of affecting such large areas of the battlefield was definitely worthy of concern. If these infrasonic aircrafts could force the abyssal army all the way back to the abyssal passageway, then the human army would be a lot more comfortable and could even completely force the abyssal army into retreat, which was something that the abyssal plane definitely didn't want to see. Right at this moment, a series of pristine white mechas suddenly shot forth from the rear at high speeds. They traversed through the air between the Soul aircrafts, and there were only around 500 of them, but each of them had what appeared to be a cannon-like weapon hoisted on its shoulder. All of the cannon barrels were aimed directly at the abyssal demonic puppets. If Tang Wuling were present, he would definitely be able to recognize that this mecha squadron belonged to the Blood God Legion, and the weapons they had hoisted on their shoulders were none other than heavy iron laser guns, the very same weapon that Long Yakshu had once used to wound their lord. To put it more accurately, these were heavy iron laser cannons, as these weapons were clearly larger than the heavy iron laser gun that Long Yakshu had used. There was a high level of diversity among abyssal creatures, and many of the powerful species were only just appearing before humans for the first time, thereby catching the human army completely off guard. However, humanity had also been rapidly developing during the past several thousand years, and Eternal Heaven wasn't the only new weapon that had been developed during this time. The emergence of the abyssal demonic puppets and the mass destruction of so many Soul aircrafts finally forced Uglanzi to unleash one of his trump cards in the form of this mega squadron. Chapter 1856, Twin Life Demonic Puppets. The Blood God Legion was situated in an extremely sparsely populated area to guard the abyssal passageway there, and that was also the type of place where the Federation would test all types of super weapons. As such, abyssal creatures made for the perfect lab rats to test those weapons on. Thus, almost all powerful new weapons were immediately sent to the Blood God Legion for testing, and heavy iron laser weapons were no exception. The Blood God Legion had been prioritized when it came to the assignment of these weapons, and even though the Central Legion also possessed heavy iron laser weapons, they didn't anywhere near as much as the Blood God Legion did. The heavy iron laser cannons currently being used by the Blood God Legion were the most powerful heavy iron laser weapons that had been developed to date. Heavy iron laser guns were able to scorch an enemy's internal organs, while heavy iron laser cannons could essentially inject the power of bombs into the bodies of enemies, causing them to explode. Prepare to fire. The white mecha flying at the very forefront of the squadron had red patterns on its surface, and it was being piloted by none other than Zhang Wanyun. This mecha was a divine grade mecha, and it was the only mecha in the Blood God Legion that had permission to adopt a different color scheme from the set conventions. Zhang Wanyun had been battling abyssal creatures for most of his life, but this was the first time he had ever seen so many abyssal creatures at once. In particular, the likes of the abyssal spirit dragons, abyssal evil sickles, and abyssal demonic puppets had never been seen even by the Blood God Legion. He was well aware of the significance of this battle to all of humanity. The outcome of this battle could very well decide the fate of the entire planet. Bursts of blue light began to glow on the heavy iron laser cannons as they began to accumulate power. Right at this moment, the 5 abyssal spirit dragons being carried by the abyssal demonic puppets suddenly screeched in unison. With their immense spiritual power, they could sense just how dangerous these white mechas were, so they immediately chose to unleash spiritual attacks. However, right at this moment, a huge mirror appeared in front of Zhang Wanyun, and it expanded to encompass virtually the entire sky. This was his martial soul true body. The surface of the giant mirror rippled violently like water, and in the eyes of the abyssal creatures, all of the Soul aircrafts and mechas had suddenly disappeared. All they could see was a reflection of themselves. In the next instant, powerful spiritual fluctuations surged toward them as the spiritual attacks unleashed by the 5 abyssal spirit dragons were completely reflected to target the abyssal demonic puppets. Abyssal demonic puppets possessed exceptional physical and spiritual resistance, but even so, they were still plunged into a state of chaos, and many of them plummeted straight out of the sky. Fortunately for them, those Those that did fall out of the sky managed to recover even before plummeting to the ground, and they flapped their wings vigorously to return to their original altitude. This was one of Jiang Wanyun's powerful soul skills, Mirror Mirage, and it was capable of reflecting all attacks. This soul skill actually wasn't all that practical against soul masters as it required too much time to prepare and unleash, and it could only reflect attacks toward a set direction. However, Jiang Wanyun was a soldier, and this soul skill was exceptionally useful in a battlefield. Even though Mirror Mirage wasn't able to destroy the oncoming abyssal creatures, it had bought the Blood God Legion sufficient time. Even more importantly, with Mirror Mirage standing in the way, the abyssal spirit dragons and abyssal demonic puppets were completely unable to see what was happening up ahead. Even their spiritual power was being kept at bay. Fire! Jiang Wanyun roared. Ball of blue light appeared in the cannon barrels of the Blood God Legion mechas, and invisible light waves instantly surged toward the oncoming abyssal creatures. In the instant that Jiang Wanyun issued this order, his Mirror Mirage also vanished. At this point, the abyssal demonic puppets were already no more than 2 kilometers away from the mecha squadron, yet all of the abyssal demonic puppets flying at the very forefront suddenly fell completely still in midair. Immediately thereafter, one explosion took place after another, and one of each of the affected abyssal demonic puppets' heads exploded, while their bodies were enveloped in dense clouds of grey mist. Jiang Wanyun was ecstatic to see this. As expected, the heavy iron laser cannons were working. They destroyed targets from the inside and were perfect for targeting abyssal creatures with powerful defenses like these ones. However, in the next instant, his pupils abruptly contracted. The grey mist only paused for a moment before the abyssal demonic puppets that were supposed to have been killed rushed out and continued on toward the mecha squadron. However, the 2 heads on their shoulders had now been reduced to 1. These things had 2 lives. Jiang Wanyun immediately came to this realization, and his heart sank as it dawned on him. Heavy iron laser cannons were extremely powerful, but a cooldown period of 5 minutes came after each usage. The enemies were only less than 2 kilometers away. Where were they going to find these 5 minutes from? Under the protection of the abyssal demonic puppets, none of the 5 abyssal spirit dragons were struck by the heavy iron lasers, and at this point, their bodies had turned red once again, so light of debilitation was sure to follow. The combination of light of debilitation and the immense offensive prowess of the abyssal demonic puppets was sure to be a recipe for disaster. The front limbs of the abyssal demonic puppets flying at the very forefront turned green, and streaks of green light shot forth from them. In a normal aerial battle, Jiang Wanyun would command all of the aircrafts and mechas to disperse and retreat to open up some distance between themselves and the enemy until the heavy iron laser cannons were ready to fire again. However, they couldn't afford to retreat now. The main weakness of the infrasonic aircrafts was their slow speed. If they were to retreat, then the infrasonic aircrafts would be completely exposed to the enemy, and they would definitely be destroyed, which was something that absolutely could not be allowed to happen. Thus, Jiang Wanyun was facing a very difficult decision. Mirror Mirage appeared once again to reflect those corrosive streaks of green light, but it was very difficult for him to oversee the entire battlefield on his own. He could block the first round of attacks, but he couldn't keep this up forever. Right at this critical juncture, a sharp screeching sound suddenly rang out from either side, and immediately thereafter, countless soul laser beams and all types of soul missiles shot forth from the distance. Over 300 soul aircrafts arrived on the scene at high speeds, attacking the abyssal demonic puppets from both the right and the left. Jiang Wanyun's eyes immediately lit up upon seeing this. Judging from the insignias on the aircrafts, it was clear that they were from the Western Legion and Northwestern Legion. One had to realize that soul aircrafts were extremely precious for any legion. Not only were they extremely expensive to produce, they were immensely effective on the battlefield, and all legion commanders held their soul aircrafts close to their hearts. Thus, even Guanxi only ordered the Western Legion and Northwestern Legion to look after the airspace above their own encampments, rather than command them to deploy their soul aircrafts onto the battlefield. As for the Southern Legion and Northern Legion, they didn't even have a single soul aircraft between them. Judging from the numbers, these were most likely all of the soul aircrafts the Western Legion and the Northwestern Legion had, and they had arrived right in the nick of time. Nice. Jiang Wanyun couldn't help but yell as he sat in his mecha's pilot room. This was what the federal military was supposed to be all about. All of the legions had to be completely unified and unselfish in the face of these formidable foes. Dong Xian had finally learned his lesson and deployed his trump card at this crucial juncture. Chapter 1857, Might of the Heavy Iron Laser Weapons. With the arrival of the soul aircrafts, Jiang Wanyun immediately issued an order, upon which the Blood God Legion's mechas escorted the infrasonic aircrafts of the Central Legion on a slow retreat. At the same time, the infrasonic aircrafts intensified their assault on the oncoming abyssal demonic puppets. It would be very difficult to kill creatures as powerful as abyssal demonic puppets through infrasonic sound waves alone, but the sound waves would at least be constantly debilitating them. With the experience that had been gained through the previous battle, the soul aircrafts of the Western Legion and Northwestern Legion had adopted a very good strategy, where they split up and fought individually rather than in groups, doing their best to distance themselves from one another so they could make better use of their speed to pester the enemy. At the same time, they were doing everything in their power to avoid direct clashes in case they were affected by the abyssal spirit dragons. The 5 abyssal spirit dragon had already released light of debilitation earlier, and they had been battling for quite some time, so they were already considerably taxed. Furthermore, abyssal demonic puppets ranked only slightly below them in the abyssal plane, and they didn't dare to devour abyssal creatures of such a high caliber. As for low-grade abyssal creatures like abyssal bomber hornets, they were unable to approach the abyssal spirit dragons due to the infrasonic sound waves, so the spirit dragons were severely limited. However, it was under these circumstances that the abyssal demonic puppets displayed their tremendous combat prowess. Not only were they extremely fast, they were also exceptionally agile, and they quickly separated in midair before unleashing attacks on the soul aircrafts. Even the slightest contact with the corrosive green light they were releasing would result in erosion of a soul aircraft's protective barrier, forcing them to abandon the barrier. Furthermore, any aircrafts that were struck by this light would instantly be eroded and explode. Even so, due to the fact that the soul aircrafts were employing guerrilla warfare tactics, the casualties were limited to a manageable extent, and the abyssal demonic puppets were left feeling quite frustrated. The infrasonic sound waves were constantly negatively affecting them, and the effects were particularly pronounced for those that had been blasted by the heavy iron laser cannons earlier. Each abyssal demonic puppet did indeed affect 2 lives, but they only had 1 body, and even though they could survive a lethal attack, it took some time to recover from the residual damage, but they clearly didn't have that luxury right now. Abyssal demonic puppets possessed incredible defensive prowess, but heavy iron laser cannons were the perfect counter to them as these weapons destroyed the target from the inside. In addition to that, there were the infrasonic aircrafts, and the mighty army of abyssal demonic puppets was unable to perform to even half of its usual maximum capacity. Weapons fully recharged. Finally, the heavy iron laser cannons were recharged. Jiang Wanyun immediately issued the order to fire upon hearing this, and the cannons locked onto one abyssal demonic puppet after another once again, particularly those that had already lost a head. In the next instant, an invisible laser beam shot forth, and one abyssal demonic puppet after another exploded before falling out of the sky. Jiang Wanyun was struck by an urge to shed tears upon seeing this. Over a third of the abyssal demonic puppets had perished, disintegrating into extremely dense clouds of grey energy that surged toward the abyssal passageway, and one could see just how powerful they were from observing the density of their abyssal energy. Of the roughly 2/3 that had survived, a good portion of them only had 1 head left each. The spirit sovereign immediately let loose a sharp screech upon seeing this. These losses were too heavy, and he was finally issuing the order to retreat. Only then did the abyssal demonic puppets swivel around and fly back toward the abyssal passageway. The attacks from the soul aircrafts were completely unable to harm their bodies and could only raise some sparks against their skin, thereby further highlighting just how important the heavy iron laser cannons were. The combination of the soul aircrafts, heavy iron laser cannons, and infrasonic aircrafts was exerting significant pressure on the abyssal creatures. Normal abyssal creatures were severely affected by the infrasonic sound waves, while more powerful abyssal creatures were threatened by the heavy iron laser cannons. As the commander on this section of the battlefield, Jiang Wanyun chose not to initiate an attack on the abyssal passageway. Instead, he led his troops to skirt around the abyssal passageway, clearing away the enemies on the sides. Not only were they inflicting heavy losses on enemy troops, most importantly, they were buying time for the second defensive line. The Hornet Sovereign was forced to flee in a panic. Her army of abyssal bomber hornets were extremely susceptible to the infrasonic sound waves. Upon being affected, an abyssal bomber hornet would immediately explode, causing chain reactions that set off more explosions among its brethren. No matter how quickly they were being resurrected in the abyssal plane, it couldn't match the rate at which they were perishing. Thus, Thus, control over the airspace had been seized by the human army. Even the mighty Abyssal demonic puppets were unable to turn the tables, and the other Abyssal creatures were unable to do anything, either. Human weaponry had finally begun to play an important role on this battlefield. The Spirit Sovereign's eyes narrowed slightly as he appraised the battlefield around him. The human limit Douluos in their suits of four-word battle armor was severely restricting the Abyssal army, and Gyuna's divine origin realm spiritual power was also affecting him. He still had many trump cards that were yet to be unveiled, but he didn't want to reveal them too early. As he resisted the bombardment of Gyuna's elemental attacks, he cast a cold gaze toward the human air units in the distant sky. Zhang Wanyun was being very careful to only travel along the outskirts of the battlefield, and at this point, the Abyssal creatures that had rushed onto the mountain summits had all been forced back. Aside from the Abyssal spirit dragons that were able to conceal themselves and escape very quickly, all of the other Abyssal creatures were struggling to deal with this lethal combination. Even with the tremendous defensive prowess that Guardian Longhorned beetles possessed, they would still explode and perish in the face of several dozens of heavy iron laser cannon attacks. On the ground, the Tank's Mega Squadron was saving the day, while the air units were dominating the airspace. All of a sudden, the human army had gained an advantage. The Spirit Sovereign was struck by the feeling that humans truly had become different during these past 6,000 years. 6,000 years ago, humans definitely weren't this powerful, regardless of whether it was in terms of soul weapons or the power of individual soul masters. Back then, battle armor was still in a development stage, and there was no four-word battle armor yet. Under the enhancements of these suits of four-word battle armor, these human limit Douluos were already able to match the power of Abyssal Sovereigns. As such, when faced with the powerful beings of the Tang Sect, Shrek Academy, the Spirit Pagoda, the Battle God Hall, and some other obscure yet powerful clans, the powerful beings of the Abyssal army weren't able to gain the upper hand, and that was the main issue. In reality, there weren't that many suits of four-word battle armor even until very recently. However, Tang Wulian's emergence drastically lowered the difficulty of four-word battle armor crafting, and his heavenly refinement drew upon the power of elemental tribulations, which was the power of the plane to begin with. Thus, the suits of four-word battle armor that he crafted were of an extremely high quality. At this moment, the limit Douluos on the battlefield were exerting sufficient pressure on the Abyssal emperors and sovereigns to prevent them from having a larger impact on the entire battlefield. Now that the situation on the outskirts of the battlefield had been stabilized, the limit Douluos were able to focus more on the battles at hand. Right at this moment, a violent explosion suddenly erupted in the distance, and this explosion took place. Everyone on the battlefield, regardless of whether they were humans or Abyssal creatures, was struck by the feeling that heaven and earth had been turned on their heads. Chapter 1858. He'll be back. What was happening? The earth was quaking, the entire planet seemed to be trembling, the sky was shaking, and it could be seen that massive cracks had appeared in the distant sky, spanning an area of tens of thousands of square meters. Terrifying suction force surged out of these cracks, and even from the battlefield, it could be seen that countless units of seawater were being drawn up and devoured by these cracks. It was as if a reverse waterfall of seawater had taken shape between heaven and earth, presenting an awe-inspiring sight to behold. Everyone stopped what they were doing and turned to gawk at this miraculous spectacle. In the next instant, a fearsome energy storm swept forth from the distance in a frenzy. Having traveled over such a long distance, the energy storm had already been weakened significantly, but all of the powerful beings on the battlefield still had to resist with all their might to prevent themselves from being swept away. Good heavens! What kind of power could have triggered something like this? Everyone was astonished. Thankfully, the human air units were quite far away in the distance, and they had all activated their protective barriers right away. Even so, they were still swept away for several kilometers before finally coming to rest again. In terms of pure energy output alone, this explosion was not inferior to the eternal heaven blast. Perhaps the explosive power at the epicenter of the explosion would still be rather lacking, but it definitely wasn't inferior by much when it came to overall power. Light Dark Douluo's expression suddenly changed drastically as she let loose a panicked cry, and she immediately disengaged herself from her battle as she transformed into a giant golden and black dragon, flying frantically toward the direction the explosion had come from. Just now, she had sensed an extremely familiar aura in that enormous energy storm, and she knew exactly whom this aura belonged to. However, as the energy storm arrived, that aura was fading at an astonishing rate. No, no, no. Long Yayu was yelling to herself in panic and horror as she pushed her elderly body beyond its limits, reaching a higher speed than she had ever achieved. The sea was churning, and after devouring a gargantuan amount of seawater, the cracks in the sky were slowly closing. Atop a giant wave stood a single person. It was none other than Chen Xinji. He appeared to be as immovable as a mountain, but if one were to pay close attention, they would discover that his eyes had already completely dimmed. The entire breastplate of his four-word battle armor had been shattered, and even though it was doing its best to repair itself, the purplish golden light clinging to those cracks completely thwarted those efforts. Not only that, but even his sea god's helmet had a crack running down the middle, extending all the way to the front. The divine tool's aura had been significantly weakened, and it felt as if it could shatter at any moment. However, Chen Xinji's chest remained tall and proud, and his hands were clasped behind his back, while the sea was carrying his body from below. In the distance, there was a purplish golden figure hovering in midair, and she was appraising Chen Xinji's surprise in her eyes. A trail of purplish golden blood was flowing down from a corner of her mouth, and her hair was looking rather disheveled, while her breathing had become quite urgent and shallow. The purplish golden energy around her was rippling in an unstable manner, and she said in a cold voice, "You should be very proud of yourself for being able to hurt me, Chen Xinji." Chen Xinji sighed. It's a pity that it still wasn't enough. In any case, I'm glad I got to experience godly power in the twilight of my life. If I were 50 years younger and could survive from this ordeal, then perhaps I really would have a chance to pursue that world. Demon Sovereign's cold eyes softened a little upon hearing this. You are a man who pursues extremes. At the very least, you are one of the very few humans whom I'm slightly fond of. A mocking look appeared on Chen Xinji's face. I don't need fondness from someone like you. I'm just disappointed that I wasn't able to stop you. Even so, you won't succeed, Demon Sovereign. I can sense that he's about to return, and once he does, he'll stomp you into the dirt like an ant. Demon Sovereign's expression changed slightly upon hearing this. Are you talking about him? Even if he does return, I'll kill him just the same. He better return soon. Otherwise, once I create my divine realm, I'll make sure he never leaves. You don't succeed, Chen Xinji said with absolute conviction in his eyes. Right at this moment, a melodious dragon's roar rang out, and a black and golden dragon approached the scene from a distance at an astonishing speed. The golden scales gradually turned white to contrast with the black half of the dragon's body, and the air around the dragon was warping violently in the face of the dragon's raging blood essence fluctuations. Even in the face of Demon Sovereign, Chen Xinji hadn't displayed so much as a single hint of fear, but upon seeing this figure, a horrified look finally appeared on his face. He mustered up all of what little remained of his strength, and yelled with all his might, "Go away! Get away from here!" However, the dragon seemed to be unable to hear him, and it was still approaching rapidly, arriving on the scene in the blink of an eye. The dragon let loose a grief-stricken cry at the sight of Chen Xinji before descending from the heavens, reverting back into its human form as it did so. Long Yayu drifted down in front of Chen Xinji and threw his arms around her. "Xinji, please don't scare me like this." Her voice was trembling as she was completely unable to sense any life force remaining in Chen Xinji's body, and that scared her more than anything ever had. She felt as if her own breath was about to cease. This man had affected her throughout her entire life, and it could almost be said that he had ruined her life, but seeing him on the brink of death, none of that was important anymore. At their age, they had already made peace with the concept of death, but that only applied to themselves. How could she possibly make peace with the fact that the person she loved more than anyone in the world was about to die? Demon Sovereign had been radiating killing intent just a moment ago, but after hearing that heartbroken cry, it was as if her heartstrings had been violently tugged on, and she shuddered as she lowered her hand again. Strong emotions began to surface in her eyes as she watched Long Yayu throwing her arms around Chen Xinji, and she couldn't help but think back to her past. Once upon a time, she was just like this human woman. However, at the time of her husband's death, she wasn't even able to see or say anything to him. At the time, she had been living a life free from concern and worry in the gentle sea. Under her husband's protection, the sea was not just their home, but also their territory upon which no one could encroach. However, her husband was dead just like that, killed by sea god Tang-san. From that day forth, she suddenly discovered that the sea soul beasts that had treated her with the utmost respect were beginning to change. They began to invade her husband's former territory, and her home was destroyed. If it weren't for the fact that his husband had given her his precious well-being following his death and arranged a plan for her to ensure self-preservation, she and her daughter would have most likely already been hunted down. However, the unforgettable hatred and yearning for her past husband refused to fade in the slightest even over the span of 20,000 years. She was pursuing vengeance, not just against the human race, but also against all sea soul beasts. Her heart had been driven to insanity, and right as she was transforming the ocean into a sea of blood, she encountered the evil soul masters of the Holy Spirit cult. They temporarily convinced her to to calm down by suggesting that they had a way to resurrect her husband. Chapter 1859. I won't let you abandon me. After that came the subsequent plan, and if she wanted to complete this plan, she had to calm down. Otherwise, there were many things that she wouldn't be able to do. For this purpose, the Holy Spirit cult had developed a type of medicine for her to repress her deranged emotions and spirit, and the medicine was completed with assistance from the Spirit Pagoda. Of course, the Spirit Pagoda had no idea for what purpose the Holy Spirit cult had been developing this medicine. Looking at Long Yayu and Chen Xinji, she couldn't help but think back to her past husband and these past 20,000 years of insanity. All of a sudden, she found herself completely transfixed and absorbed by her memories. I'm fine. Chen Xinji raised a hand to try and caress Long Yayu's cheek, but he only made it halfway before his hand fell limply to his side again. Long Yayu hurriedly grabbed onto his hand and placed it onto her own cheek. Chen Xinji's eyes were slightly out of focus as he appraised Long Yayu with a gentle expression. You've become old, Yayu, and so have I. Tears were gushing out of Long Yayu's eyes. You're a bastard. You ruined my life, and now, you're abandoning me. I won't have it. I won't let you abandon me. Chen Xinji sighed. I'm sorry. Leaving you was the worst decision I ever made in my life. If I hadn't been so stubborn, perhaps the tragedies between us would have never happened. After you told me the truth that day, I felt like my entire world had collapsed around me. I wanted to tear myself to shreds, but I knew that there was no point in doing that. In the instant I decided to tell you where eternal heaven was truly being stored, I had already decided that I wouldn't leave you ever again no matter how you treated me. I'm satisfied as long as I can sense your aura within a certain range. All I want is to continue to live as Old Man Chen the Sweeper and accompany you in completing the final phase of the journeys of our lives. However, the heavens refuse to grant me this opportunity. Yayu, if reincarnation exists, I'll stay with you every single day in our next lives, and I'll do whatever you want me to do. You're an idiot. Long Yayu sobbed. If you lost your stubbornness, your resolution, your drive, your sense of self, would you still be the Chen Xinji I love? I never wanted you to be some sweeper. I only wanted to stay by your side. In my heart, you're an unmatched hero, an almighty figure in the Soulmaster world. I love the Chen Xinji who can carry the weight of the world on his shoulders. To be honest, I never hated. I never went to find you because I was scared to see you. I felt like I didn't deserve to see you again as I was unable to give birth to our child. I was in so much pain after losing our child. What I wanted more than anything was to give birth to him, then take him to see you. Even if you didn't want me anymore, I wouldn't have left. However, our child was miscarried, and that dealt me an extremely heavy blow. At the time, you were at an important point in your career. If I had gone to find you then, I knew that you would return to my side without any hesitation. But you were the heir to your family and the most brilliant young talent in the military. If you were to marry a high-ranking member of Shrek Academy, your future would be flushed down the drain. Hence, I didn't go see you. I missed you so much, but I still didn't go to find you. By the time you had reached the peak and everything had stabilized, I finally worked up the courage to see you. But I received news of your engagement. On your wedding day, I looked at you from afar among all of the guests, and I felt like my tears would never stop. Even so, I still didn't hate you, but my heart died on that day. Chen Xinji was rooted to the spot as he listened to Long Yayu's story, and he closed his eyes with a pained expression. Only now did he truly understand her heart. Perhaps the difference had been nothing more than a single day. Perhaps if his engagement had been delayed by a single day, Long Yayu would have come to see him, and they wouldn't have missed out on a life of happiness together. He had never truly loved his wife. Their marriage had been an entirely politically motivated one. Even if Long Yayu had come to him on his wedding day, he would have abandoned his bride and left with her without any hesitation. However, she had refrained from doing that for the sake of his career. Everything that she had done was for his sake. She had done all of this for his benefit, yet she had dug herself deep into the pit of despair in the process. Somehow, Chen Xinji was able to summon the strength to lift his arms and tightly embrace the woman of his heart. You are the idiot, Yayu. Why were you so foolish? You really are the biggest idiot in the world. His voice was also trembling with tears as he spoke. His life force had already completely faded, and he was only just barely clinging onto a shred of his soul with his divine origin realm spiritual power. But he really didn't want to let go. 100 years had passed by in the blink of an eye, but before this moment, he didn't feel as if he had ever truly lived. Long Yayu was also holding tightly onto him. Xinji, do you want to see me back when we first met? Chen Xinji faltered slightly upon hearing this, and a warm smile appeared on Long Yayu's face as gentle golden light swirled around her. Her white hair gradually turned black and lengthened until it pulled all the way down past her backside. Her wizened features gradually became rejuvenated, and all of her wrinkles faded away. Her eyes became clear and incredibly captivating, and her tears receded, replaced by a joyful and passionate expression. She was so beautiful. She was once the #1 beauty of Shrek Academy. Chen Xinji stared at her in a slack-jawed manner, and it really was as if he had returned to the moment when they had first met. He could still clearly recall how entranced he had been when he had seen her for the first time. He simply couldn't take his eyes off her. In his youth, all he did was cultivate. He didn't believe in love, nor did he have any interest in relationships. However, on that day, he saw her beside the sea god's lake, and everything changed. That was an unforgettable view, and in that instant, he became a believer of love at first sight. Thus, he stayed at Shrek Academy to study as an exchange student, also that he could remain by her side. At the time, she had many pursuers, all of whom were extremely powerful, and there was certainly no lack of love rivals more powerful than him. Thus, he began to engage in a very idiotic endeavor. He would challenge anyone who pursued her, and most of the time, all he received for his efforts was a beating. But he never gave up. He continued to work tirelessly in his cultivation, also that he could chase away everyone around her. He had the courage to challenge all of the men in Shrek Academy, but not enough courage to confess to her, until that day, at the Sea God Fate matchmaking convention. As an exchange student, he wasn't supposed to have been allowed to participate in the event, but he had rushed onto the lake without any thought of consequences and finally confessed to her. As she removed her mask, the entire lake around him seemed to dim, and he could still clearly recall that moment as if it had happened yesterday. Chapter 1860, dying in each other's arms. Chen Xinji's appearance also began to change. Just like Long Yayu, his wrinkles gradually faded, and his hair turned black again. He still stood tall and proud, but he became a little thinner than he was now. He became handsome and dashing, and his eyes were filled with confidence and persistence. No obstacles could stand in his way, and he looked deep into her eyes with his own intense gaze. The first thing about Chen Xinji that caught her attention had been his eyes. She had already noticed him the first time he set his eyes on her, and at the time, all she felt was this exchange student seemed really dumb. However, his eyes were so intense with particularly large irises, and he was staring at her unbridled passion. There were many boys who liked her, but never had she met anyone who stared at her all the time and went wherever she did. Even as she walked into her classrooms for her lessons, he would continue to stare at her from outside the windows. Those eyes made her feel a little panicked and embarrassed, but in the end, they left a deep impression on her. She was actually aware of everything that happened after that. Apparently, the new exchange student was very fond of picking fights under the guise of sparring matches. On one occasion, she saw him after one of these fights, and he had been beaten black and blue. However, as he struggled to his feet, she was greeted by the sight of a pair of incredibly determined eyes. It was that pair of intense eyes that made her instantly recognize him. He naturally saw her as well, but he merely looked at her without saying anything. After that, Long Yayu gradually noticed a pattern, which was that all of the male students who confessed to her would receive a challenge from him at some point. In the beginning, he was always getting beaten, but even so, he would still continue to challenge these male students without any hesitation, all the way until he could beat his rival. Later on, there were very few students capable of beating him, and he was almost always able to win the battles. After that, Long Yayu heard that whenever he beat an opponent, he would warn them to stay away from her. Her first reaction to this was one of anger. How dare he interfere with her life like this? She even wanted to confront him about this, but he was always avoiding her while appraising her from afar. That all changed on that day during the Sea God Fate matchmaking convention. She had just entered the inner court, and he had also arrived at the convention. He was an exchange student from another academy, so he wasn't allowed to participate in the convention, but he rushed out without any regard of the consequences, determined to make his confession even if it meant ruining the convention. In that instant, he was so brave. There was no hesitation or fear in his eyes as he yelled in front of everyone, Long Yayu, I love you. In that instant, she was moved by his determination. Even more importantly, she was attracted to his unyielding spirit and unshakable determination. Even she didn't understand why she had accepted his confession, but in any case, he flew over to her and latched onto her hand, and the two of them left the sea god's lake. He gripped onto her hand very tightly, to the point that she was feeling some pain from his grip, but at the same time, she could clearly sense what he was feeling. It was from that moment forth that she fell in love with him. Perhaps he had already claimed a place in her heart before this, but she simply never noticed. The year after that was a year that neither of them would ever forget. Long Yeyu, I love you, Chen Zhenji said in an earnest manner. Long Yeyu wound her arms around his neck, and replied, Chen Zhenji, I love you, too. In that instant, the Abyssal army and demon sovereign no longer had anything to do with them. They only had eyes for each other. A smile appeared on Chen Zhenji's face, and the smile was so relaxed and joyful. However, the light in his eyes also completely faded in this instant, and they held only a reflection of the woman before him. She didn't cry. She merely continued to hold onto him. He was no longer able to support himself with the sea, but he was held aloft by her. She held tightly onto him so that there was no space between the two of them. Even in the instant that he left this world, he still maintained his youthful state. How he wished that his younger self could have remained true to his determination and stayed by her side. We may be parted in this life, but fate has brought us together in the end. Zinji, we'll never be separated again. Long Ye murmured to herself with a faint smile, and she closed her eyes as sorrowful dragon's roars rang out around her. Two giant dragons, one black and one white, rose up into the air, and they seemed to be telling a story through their roars. In that instant, she had already closed her eyes and rested her head against his chest, and her aura had completely faded. The battlefield was no longer important to her. The two of them had been bound by responsibilities for their entire lives, and now, all she wanted was to stay by his side and never part with him. A huge wave swept up to devour them, but the two dragons lingered in the sky, roaring with grief as they performed a sorrowful dance. Both sea god Douluo Chen Zhenji and light dark Douluo Long Yeyu had fallen. On the main battlefield in the distance, Yeli's heart suddenly jolted as she exclaimed, Elder Long. She had known Long Yeyu for many years and was extremely familiar with Long Yeyu's aura, but all of a sudden, that aura had completely vanished, and it could only mean one thing. How could this be? She was so powerful. How could she have fallen? Everyone else quickly noticed the astonishment that Yali was displaying, and their hearts immediately sank. Right at this moment, a vast expanse of purplish golden light appeared in the distance, surging toward the battlefield like an all-encompassing tide. The fearsome purplish golden wave brought with it enormous pressure, striking all of the humans on the battlefield with an overwhelming sense of asphyxiation. A sinister look appeared on the spirit sovereign's face. She's finally here. This is where you all die. Now that the battle on the sea was over, it was time to destroy the defensive lines of the human army and release the abyssal creatures onto the continent. As soon as the purplish golden figure appeared on the battlefield, she instantly became the center of everyone's attention. One figure after another also flew out of the abyssal passageway and appeared behind her. These were none other than the powerful beings of the Holy Spirit cult that hadn't been involved in this battle earlier. Ghost Emperor and Infernal Emperor were directly behind Demon Sovereign, and following them were the four heavenly monarchs. The seven of them were giving off a mountainous aura as they slowly advanced, and the limit Douluos of the human army reflexively gathered together to oppose them. The emperors and sovereigns of the abyss also joined the powerful beings of the Holy Spirit cult, and the situation took another turn. The Spirit Sovereign cast his gaze toward Demon Sovereign, and a hint of envy appeared in his eyes. He still hadn't reached the godly level yet, but she had already attained what he had been pursuing for all this time. It wasn't that he didn't have any chances to make the breakthrough in the abyssal plane, but he was constantly being repressed by the Holy Lord. Even though Demon Sovereign still wasn't a true deity yet, her powers had already reached the godly level. Yuna had also sensed this, and her expression changed drastically at the sight of Demon Sovereign. She had well and truly attained godly power. Even the planar ruler didn't seem to be able to repress her power any longer. You're Demon Sovereign? Yali asked with a furious expression. The fact that Ghost Emperor and Infernal Emperor were standing behind her was a clear indication that she was the current leader of the Holy Spirit cult. Demon Sovereign replied, That's right. I'm glad you're all gathered here today. It saves me the trouble of having to hunt you down one by one. All of you must die and become sacrifices to my new blood river god slayer array. Where is Elder Long? What did you do to her? Yali asked. Thanks so much for watching this video. Don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Also leave a comment down below with suggestions on what novels to read.